Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for being with me for today's devotion. We are in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And in this chapter, Paul talks about marriage, the husband-wife relationship, about sexual intimacy, being married to an unbeliever. I mean, he covers a lot of different subjects. They're related, but it's a lot of different details. And I just want to point out some things before I share with you my devotional thought. The first thing is in chapter 7, verse 1. We read, "Now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." But notice, the things which you wrote. They had written a letter to Paul with a bunch of questions, apparently. So not only had he received feedback or news and heard about their divisions and arguing and all that, they had actually sent him a letter asking for answers to certain questions. Back in chapter 5, verse 9 of 1 Corinthians, Paul says, "I wrote you in my letter not to whatever." So they had written Paul a letter. He had written them a letter before. Which order they came in, we don't know. The letter that he refers to in chapter 5, verse 9, is it a lost letter that we don't have that's in our Bible? Some think so. Others think it's actually a shorter letter that's incorporated somehow into either 1st or 2nd Corinthians. We just don't know. But the point is, there was more communication between Paul and the churches than just what we have in our New Testament. So just know that, and that really shouldn't surprise us. Now, regarding the content of chapter 7, he talks about sex in marriage in verses 1 through 5. So let's look at that. "Now, concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." You'll see in this chapter, Paul thought it was a good thing for a man or a woman to be celibate, to not be married, so they could give themselves entirely to serving Jesus. Verse 2, "But because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer, and then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." We'll talk about it more in a little bit, but Paul was single and apparently didn't really understand some of the blessings of marriage, and so he tends to think that sexual temptation is one of the big reasons to be married instead of staying single, and there's truth in that. But the point that I want to bring out in these verses is that it is wrong for a husband or wife to use sex as a weapon, as leverage in the marriage, to use sex to manipulate, to get your own way. It's wrong to do that. It's wrong to deprive your partner of their sexual needs. He makes that very clear, that, and it's not one-sided, it's mutual. So that's what he says about sex and marriage. We know elsewhere in Scripture that it's a gift from God to be enjoyed, not just to procreate children, but to be enjoyed. So don't use it as a weapon, and care for one another and each other's physical needs. Now, I mentioned Paul was not married. Look at, starting at verse 7. He said, "Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am." What does he mean by that? Well, that he's single. "However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that manner." We're not all the same, can't all do the same things. Verse 8, he continues, "But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, that it is good for them if they remain even as I am." So he's saying to the unmarried and the widows, it's good if you stay like I am, meaning that he's not married. And he thinks that's the better way because you can give your time to God. Verse 9, "But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it's better to marry than to burn with passion." Again, getting to his, his understanding of marriage, but there's also truth in that. There is. Dropping down to verses 32 and so on, he says there are certain advantages to being single as a Christian versus being married. In verse 32, he said, "But I want you to be free from concern. one who is unmarried. And that first phrase is referring to the verses that come before, where he says, when you're married, you have all these other concerns, responsibilities. I'd like it if you were free of all those so you could be freer to serve Jesus. I want you to be free from concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife, and his interests are divided. The woman who is unmarried and the virgin is concerned about the things of the Lord. If they're Christians, that's who he's talking about here, that she may be holy both in body and spirit. But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And so he's just saying, one of the advantages of being single is that you can devote more of your attention, your heart, your passion, your time, your energy to serving Jesus. Whereas if you're married, it's divided. You love Jesus first and you serve Jesus, but you also have to, take the time and the energy to care for your family. So that's the point that he's making. He also in this chapter addresses marriage between two people who are not Christians. Let me rephrase that so more accurately. Two people. One is a believer, the other is not a believer. One is a disciple of Jesus, the other is not a disciple of Jesus. Look with me at verse 12, starting at verse 12 down to verse 16. He said, to the rest I say, not the Lord. This is Paul's opinion. He's giving his advice, that if any brother has a wife, so a brother, a believer, has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, wants to stay married to them, he must not divorce her. You got to remember, this is a new church in Corinth in a pagan area, and people were getting saved. And so you have these couples who've been married for a short time or a long time, and suddenly one of them becomes a Christian and the other one does not. That's the situation he's dealing with. And she wants to, so if you're a husband, a man, you become a Christian, and your wife is willing to still be married to you, then don't divorce her. Vice versa, in verse 13, the same thing if a woman becomes a believer and has an unbelieving husband. If he's willing to live with her, hey, great, don't divorce him. Verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through the believing husband, etc., down to verse 15. Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, so the one who's not a Christian, they decide, I don't want to be married to you because you became this Christian, you weirdo, or whatever. If the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. Now, he says something else about it down in verse 39. A wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if her husband is dead, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. In other words, only marry, if you end up being a widow or a widower, only marry a believer. Same thing he's talking about in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14, when he says, don't be unequally yoked together, is that a believer should be married to a believer. But if you're married to an unbeliever, don't leave them if they want to stay with you. Now, if they leave you, you're free. You're free. Now, I want to get into divorce a little bit, because he says in verses 10, 11, and 12, that, God doesn't want us to divorce. But then starting in verse 13, if your unbelieving spouse leaves, you're free from your bondage, from your obligation, you're free to marry. And, Jesus talked about divorce in the Gospels, particularly in Matthew 19, when he said, don't divorce except for adultery. And some people over the years have used that, and they call it, we call it the exception clause. And you'll hear people say the only exception that justifies divorce is adultery. Well, let me point out a couple problems with that kind of rigid thinking about that passage. I don't have time to dive into, great detail on it, but one, the Greek word translated adultery in Matthew 19 is the word porneia. There is a word for adultery. Porneia is a broader word that refers to sexual immorality of all kinds. It can include adultery, fornication, pornography, lust, homosexual activity. It's a broad word. And so what Jesus is saying, these sexual sins free you because it breaks the bond of one flesh. It doesn't say you have to divorce if they are guilty of these sexual sins, but you can. And so saying that adultery is the only justification for divorce is reading more strictly Matthew 19:9 than the Greek actually allows. The other thing is here, Paul makes another exception. The unbelieving just leaves, doesn't want to be married to you any longer. Now, I think we could assume they probably would go on and have sex with someone else, but he doesn't mention that. That's not the reason for them leaving. They leave because they just don't want to be married to a Christian. And he says, in that case, you're no longer under obligation. And so I for decades have read the scripture and not believed that actual adultery is the only justification for divorce. One, because of the word porneia, what it means, and here, the exception that Paul adds. And so I am comfortable saying to a woman, if you've got a husband who beats the you-know-what out of you, divorce him. I don't have any problem saying that. Applying these biblical teachings to everyday life can sometimes be challenging because life is not always black and white. God hates divorce. And every time there's a divorce, there's sin involved. There's never a divorce without sin. And divorce should, and in our culture, divorce comes too easily. People do it for all kinds of reasons and wrong reasons. But there are cases where it's permissible. And here, Paul allowing another exception would argue against those who want to read Matthew 9:19 as this is the only exception. Jesus allowed that exception. Doesn't mean that's the only exception that he would ever have allowed. So those are just some thoughts. Now, real quickly, because we're running a little bit long here, my devotional thought. Verse 40. Paul says, but in my opinion, she is happier, excuse me, this is talking about somebody who becomes a widow widow, or is already single. In my opinion, he says, she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think that I also have the Spirit of God. He said, I think I'm being led by the Spirit in saying this, but it's my opinion. I think she's happier if she just stays single. And I just want to say, I think Paul really believed this, and let's be honest. If the Apostle Paul had been married, had a family, he could not have done all the things he did because he would have been a neglectful husband if he had. So I get where he's coming from. I get his point. But I don't think Paul had a clue what he was missing. Paul experienced things I will never experience because he was free to go and do things that I'm not free to go and do. Because I have a wife, family. He didn't. So he was free to do things. And so he got to have experiences that I will never get to have. But at the same time, I've had experiences he never had. Paul never got to know the joy of being married to a woman you love and a woman who loves you for 43 years. And there's joy in that there is no way the Apostle Paul could have understood because he never experienced it. And so while he would say to me, Steve, you don't know what you're missing, that's true, I don't. I would say to him, Paul, you don't know what you missed either. That would also be true. Those are my thoughts for today. I'll see you tomorrow as we jump over to chapter 8. God bless you, everybody.